Welcome back to Let's Talk. This is episode 17. Today we're going to look at what I've learned in the time that I have been working with film. To provide you with some background information, this all started in the fall of 2018 when I purchased my first vintage Pentax 6x7 lens. As strange as it may seem, I've been a professional photographer for the better part of 17 years now. I had never worked with film. So when I bought the vintage 6x7 lens, as I've said in several different articles and in episodes of Let's Talk, I was having a kind of crisis of creativity, and my passion for photography was definitely waning. So the 6x7 lens turned out to be quite the can of worms. Later on, we'll talk more about what this means, but my current camera is a Pentax 645Z digital camera. And the sensor in that camera is 1/3 the size less. That is 1/3 smaller than the film used in a 6x7 camera. What I discovered in the process of using the vintage lenses was that considerably more light came into my 645Z, and it forced me to completely rethink how I was doing photography. That, in turn, inspired me to begin to think about using an actual 6x7 camera. It's a long way, however, from thinking about using a film camera to actually being able to use one effectively and efficiently. And one of the problems that I dealt with was if I decided to shoot film, there were a number of logistical problems, like where would I get them developed? Fortunately, my friend Jim Hoyle, who's been doing photography most of his life, has been able to help me through the process. I'm not yet ready to do my own developing, but I don't think I'm far away from it either. It's a question of figuring out where I'll do that, since I don't have a dedicated space for a darkroom. So let's go back. I began looking at 6x7 cameras, Pentax, because I had a storehouse of Pentax 6x7 lenses. More about that in a second. Sometime in early 2019. And I quickly discovered, as I've talked about in an earlier episode of Let's Talk, that it wasn't as simple as going to eBay, deciding how much I wanted to spend, and picking up a camera. Film cameras are very mechanical. And as I ultimately learned about the Pentax 6x7, there's no end to the things that can go wrong. And I didn't want to spend a significant amount of money. I didn't want to spend any money and have the camera essentially be useless. So, in the process of dealing with that, I found myself looking at an ever-increasing amount of money to get into the film game. So, in the end, I spent $1,200. However, let's put this in perspective. Number one, I got a mint condition camera. In fact, it had the original box, the original manual, everything about it. If it had been used, it had not been used extensively. Number two, It came with the original carrying case, kind of a gray leatherette lined in red velvet. Again, in perfect condition. I had looked at some used cameras that did not have the wood grip. You'll see that momentarily. And the wood grip itself was often selling for around $100, sometimes more, depending on its condition. In addition to that, a lot of the bodies that I was looking at didn't have any lenses. This one came with the kit 100mm lens. It also came with two other lenses, a 55 and a 200. Each of these alone, in very good to mint condition, is going to be at least $300. So if you begin to add up, just in terms of the lenses alone, and add to that the wood grip, actually, and that's $700. For $500, I got a mint condition camera. So let's take a look at what the camera actually looks like. There it is, the infamous wood grip. This camera came out very early in the I think around 1969 originally. And at that time, this was not an option. It was a waist level camera, which means that like most traditional cameras, you held it down at your waist and you looked down through a kind of ground glass to see what was coming through the lens. When this was added, as you can see here, this mechanism, which controls both the ISO and the shutter speed, was essentially clamped down on top. A bit kludgy, a bit awkward, but the state of cameras at that time. Notice also that on both sides of the camera body there are lugs because the wood grip is interchangeable, can be moved to either side. Note, however, that if you were to add a flash, it would sit there and connect via a cable to the side of the body. If I'm ever going to use this with my strobes, this is where my ProPhoto trigger would sit. I thought that with the vintage Pentax 55 to 100mm lens, my 645Z was heavy, but this one, I would guess it's almost twice as heavy. Anyway, can you hand-hold it? You can. Just keep in mind that if you're not physically strong, it can tire you out. And a lot of people have noted that when the shutter comes up, when you press the shutter release, you can have substantial movement to the camera. So if you're not strong in your upper body, I would urge you to use a tripod. A couple of other things you can't see, by the way. Up here are two very important controls. One that turns the meter on and off. There is a light meter in here, and one that locks the shutter so that you can't inadvertently fire and take a photograph. So let's take a closer look. Pentax made this version of the 6X7 camera between 1975 and 1989. Based on the serial number of my camera, it was made sometime around 1982, which means that it is in fact almost 40 years old. The ISO is rated from 12 to 3200, fairly impressive. Keep in mind that in the digital world, the lowest you're likely to go on most cameras is an ISO of 100. Some of our older Canons did 50, but not without detrimental effects for overall image quality. An ISO at the high end of 3200 now, your phone will do more. But again, this is film. Typically, I've discovered that you're going to shoot at an ISO of 400. I might soon begin looking at film that is 200. It uses two types of film, 120 and 220, 10 or 21 exposures, and the shutter speed is between 1 second and 1/1000th of a second. I haven't yet had to deal with the limitations of shutter speed, but I know they're coming for sure. Typically, when I shoot a waterfall with neutral density filters on my 645 camera, I'm anywhere from 45 to 60 seconds comfortably. And in a minute, we're going to talk about a phenomenon called reciprocity, but let's not go there that far. So theoretically, with 1 second as my longest exposure, it does limit me only because at that point I have to change to bulb mode, which means I manually control the shutter. Given that my 645 tops out at 30 seconds, I've gotten used to this. My camera also, as one of the later features, has something called mirror lockup, or MLU as it's abbreviated, which allows me to manually raise and keep the shutter up. I assume that if I go to bulb mode, I'm also going to be experimenting with MLU. I'll let you know in a subsequent talk. One of the things I didn't realize, by the way, was this. And what this means is that when I am working using the viewfinder, I don't see the entire scene. And one of the photographs, which I'm not going to put up on the screen at the moment, when Jim and I developed the last roll of film, I distinctly remember looking at a scene and saying, that's not what I saw through the shutter. Well, that's in fact the case. I was only seeing 90% of the scene. So one of the questions, I guess, going forward is how am I going to adjust to realize that I'm not seeing 10% of what the camera will capture? I don't have an answer to that yet. By the way, at this point, I have shot 4 rolls of film. Okay, let's take a look, as I promised, at the different types of camera film size. By the way, the standard in the DSLR, when it is full frame, it is considered 35 millimeter. which means that the sensor is 24 by 36 centimeters. My 645 camera, if it were film, the film would be 42 by 56. I'm using a 6 by 7 camera, 56 by 67, or roughly 60 by 70 millimeters. If you do the math, the difference between each of these is 1/3. So my 6 by 7 is 2/3 the size, or 2/3 larger than the 24 by 36 ultimately. And if you're dealing with a less than full frame DSLR, you still have the crop factor, which means your sensor is a percentage of 35 millimeter and that much smaller than the 60 by 70. Okay, having said all that, let's take a look at a couple of images. The one on the left is from my first roll of film with my Pentax 6 by 7. This one was shot with Kodak, T-Max, at an ISO of 400. Note the grain. The grain very much looks very T-shaped. The details, absolutely breathtaking. The waterfall, shot with my fourth roll of film, was shot with Ilford. HP5+. Again, take a look at the detail. I was surprised, if you look at the motion of the water, that was done without a filter, and it was certainly not a 1-second exposure. I will say that as much detail as I get out of a raw image in my 645, the amount of detail I get here dwarfs that. If we try to expand, let's see if we can blow this up a little bit. There we go. Keep in mind, this is from a JPEG. You can begin to see the formation of the grain in the actual print. Okay, let's go back down. One of the dramatic differences, let's put this back where it belongs, is that it's extremely difficult to really appreciate what these images look like until you're actually holding a print in your hand. That makes all the difference in the world. So, what exactly have I learned, and where do I go from here? Well, let's start at the beginning. Film is definitely less forgiving. I can't take the photo over. I can't change the settings in my camera rather, leave the camera on the tripod if I want to make sure the shot is absolutely reproducible. I can't bracket, at least not in the digital sense of the word. Once that shutter is pressed, that is it. I truly miss the immediate feedback. When I press the shutter on my digital camera, I can see the image on the back right away. I can call the image back up. I can zoom in. There are all kinds of things I can do with it. There's no feedback here. Press the shutter, go on to the next shot, wait until you develop it. Third, there are the challenges of developing the film. Initially, I used Jim's Mamiya 6x7 camera called an RB67. And Jim has got a development tank that does not require total darkness. The RB67 puts images down on the film in such a way that every time you shoot a roll of film, you lost one image if you use the daylight tank. Fortunately, that is not true for the Pentax 6x7, or it doesn't appear to be, at least, in the 2 rolls of film that we've so developed. It's still not a trivial process. If you think about what I'm about to tell you, you take the film, you open the tank, you make sure the tank is clean, you hook up a strap from the inside of the tank to one edge of the film, and then you crank the film in while you pull the paper away. Any one mistake along the way, the entire roll of film is lost. Once again, film is unforgiving. Once it's exposed, game, set, match. So, in addition to that, what I've learned so far is that how long you leave the film to develop and the temperature of the developer are both critical. But it would be one thing if there were an absolute set of standards by which you could do this. Unfortunately, so I noticed, for example, that the developer Jim used called for a temperature between 70 and 80 degrees, and Jim typically used the fluid at 70. I don't know what I'm giving up here, if I'm giving anything up. Does a warmer temperature change the interaction of the chemicals with the film? I'm sure to some extent it does, but at this point, I have no idea what that means. The same thing is true for how long. If you go back to the image here of the statue, that film should have remained in the developer for 6 more minutes, but Jim made a very common mistake between T-Max from Kodak and Tri-X, both of which require different development times. So as we were developing the photos from Hanging Rock here, I wasn't sure what the difference in time and temperature would ultimately do to how the images came out, which takes us back to point number 1. Film is essentially unforgiving. Bracketing all of this for the time being, however, you would think that you would take the film, put it in a scanner, and the next thing you know, you have a digital image. This is not true. And this is a nightmare. If you've watched any of the Let's Talk, in which I've looked at Silverfast scanning software, all I can tell you is you have no idea. It took the better part of 10 days to nail the process down. The software is at best kludgy, at least in terms of the user interface, while the interface of the Epson software is better. Epson does give you the option of getting the Silverfast entry-level scanning program for free, which should tell you something about how they see their software. In the end, that became quite the nightmare. I believe we're through that now. I know what to do, how to do it. I've written it all down, and I can pretty much, without a problem, produce a file that is between 215 and 230 megs, which produces superior quality. And the final piece is we've had to make some fairly substantial changes to how we post-process film. For example, since we're working only in black and white at the moment, one of the first things I discovered was that if you don't convert the scanned image from black and white to sRGB, most of the plugins you're likely to use in Photoshop or Affinity Photo won't work. Then, when you're dealing with files that are comparatively large, some of the software I like to use, like Skylum's Aurora HDR, crash and burn. Other applications we've been working with have also had problems dealing with film. You would think that in a laptop that has 32 gigs of RAM and another 6 gigabytes of dedicated video RAM on a high-performance NVIDIA video card, these problems wouldn't occur. Well, I am here to tell you they do. So where do we go from here? Well, I've got 10 more rolls of Ilford. I'm going to try in the next month to month and a half to use them all. I am probably going to try some 200 ISO film. I may even try 100 ISO. The other thing that concerns me before we talk about reciprocity is that I am having a hell of a time with the sky. One of the fundamental differences, and I hope you're listening closely to what I'm about to say, between film and digital is that in the digital world you expose for the shadows only to make sure that the highlights don't burn out. It's exactly the opposite in film. If you expose for the sky, however, as you see here, the blacks can become too black very quickly, and there's no opportunity, unlike in the digital world, to get the detail back. So in most of my photographs, the sky is without clouds, and that's something I want to work on. This was, by the way, a very blue sky kind of day, but I have other photos where there were some clouds, and they just don't really show up. I want to talk about one more thing, and then we will bring this episode to a conclusion. I've learned in the world of film that sometimes you just kind of step on stuff you don't know is there. So Jim and I were talking as we were developing my last 2 rolls of film, And I was saying, Jim, I want to use my neutral density filters on my 6x7. I definitely want to get more detail out of the sky. And Jim said, do you know what reciprocity is? Well, I know what reciprocity is in relationships. I had never heard of it in the digital world. Essentially, what it comes down to is this. If I have an exposure of 1 second and I add a neutral density filter, that essentially lowers my exposure. By 1/3 of an f-stop. My exposure will become 2 seconds. Why? Because the longer the exposure, the less sensitive to light the film becomes. Go back to what I said earlier about the camera. The camera has a maximum exposure without the bulb of 1 second. Imagine that I had been out in the late afternoon thinking that my meter, which was telling me I needed a 1 second exposure, was reading the scene through my filter accurately. Because of the factor of reciprocity, my actual exposure would have been 2 seconds. The margin of error in film is minimal. The difference between overexposed and underexposed can make the difference between an image that works and one that doesn't. Yes, I know, if you're familiar with film, you can push, you can pull, but even there are limits, and you need to know that going in. Once the film is in the developer, game, set, match. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'm going to keep you posted as we move forward. I hope you have found this interesting. All of my contact information follows. And as I'll remind you again, check out Night Vision magazine. There is a series there called The Way Back. And you'll find more information about film and vintage cameras there. Once again, thanks for listening.
If you want to contact us, we can be reached at NyghtFalcon.com or our magazine site, NightVision.com. And if you want to email me directly, you can reach me at inspiration@NyghtFalcon.com.